Welcome to week 3, part 2. We'll continue our discovery about the radio. Actually, we're going to put things into a timeline now and kind of compare the evolution of telephone and radio in the late 1800s through the early 19 or 20th century, I should say, 1900s. So we're going to start with the phone. Of course, Alexander Graham Bell invents the phone through his work on the harmonic telegraph. Around 1878, the first telephone exchange opens up in New Haven, Connecticut, not to be confused with what Stoger was working on out in Indiana. This was one of those places where the operator answered your request and then connected with a cable and connected you to another subscriber in that local town. 1885, AT&T is created. 1892, the first long-distance call was made from New York to Chicago. And it only cost $9 a minute, and that's in those days. I cannot imagine what that's worth today. 1894, Bell's patent expires, which opened up competition. In 10 years, over 6,000 phone companies were created. I have not included in here any photographs of what towns or cities looked like when you had competing phone companies, but there were wires everywhere, and it was a disaster. It ultimately drove to the creation of the Bell system. 1899, those loading coils we talked about earlier were invented, which allowed those long-distance voice calls to be made and sound better. 1913, AT&T settled its first federal antitrust lawsuit with what's known as the Kingsbury Commitment, and essentially established AT&T as a government-sanctioned monopoly. In 1915, we had the first practical electrical amplifiers installed, and AT&T opened its first transcontinental telephone line. That's the one we talked about earlier with Watson and Bell talking to each other from San Francisco to New York. This was a bargain. It was only $20.70 for 3 minutes, so you can see the price has gone down. We're less than $7 a minute compared to that price of $9 a minute back in 1892. So you can see the trend here. It was a very slow trend. The 30s and the 40s we'll talk about in future weeks. Now let's look at the radio. In 1885, Hertz demonstrated the electromagnetic wave concept for the first time. In 1891, wireless telegraphs were installed by radio for ships at sea. 1892, Tesla demonstrated his first public demonstration of what was called radio in St. Louis. In 1896, Marconi filed a patent for his radio apparatus. 1899, the first SOS ever sent from a ship. 1901, the first transatlantic radio signals were sent by Marconi between North America and Northern Europe. Huge breakthrough because they were actually able to send, this was Morse Code, and they were basically huge spark gap transmitters, but they were able to actually send a message that could be received and understood. 1902, amateur or ham radio was introduced. We'll talk more about that. 1906, a fellow by the name of DeForest created the audio-on tube, and the beauty of this tube is it amplified signals. And, when we look at the timeline 1910 and go back up to the telephone timeline 1920, those first practical electrical amplifiers were installed. Well, guess what? That tube, which would be used on the radio side, was also going to be used on the landline side. You start to see some of the technology overlap. 1910, the first radio signal ever sent from an airplane. Morse Code. Can you imagine sending code from a plane? 1912, federal regulation of the airwaves began. Now I'm going to point out something here. If you go back to the telephone timeline above, 1910, you're going to see the government-sanctioned monopoly, AT&T's monopoly. That was through government regulation. 1912, federal regulation of the airwaves began. You're starting to see the government be getting involved in regulation, and this regulation will have a huge impact on how technology evolves through the 20th century. 1918, a guy by the name of Armstrong patented a radio receiver called the super heterodyne receiver. And without getting into all the technical reasons why, it was a huge breakthrough using vacuum tubes in making receivers far more sensitive and selective in the signals they received. And of course, the 30s and 40s we'll take care of in future weeks. So let's understand how the radio industry evolved. We saw a little bit on the timeline. Once we had the ability to do voice over the airwaves, all sorts of new ideas exploded. Ship-to-shore radio with voice, which was quite a luxury for many, many years, allowed passengers and crew to keep in touch with the mainland. For most people, the cost of a voice ship-to-shore connection was prohibitively expensive, but you could still send a telegram from sea using Morse code, very brief and kind of like texting today, if you will. And it was a little bit more affordable, but now we had the ability to actually do voice from ships. From a military perspective, the advantages of the navies of the world to be kept in contact by their governments gave them what we call command and control, or C2. Now you can manage your ships and their assets real time. This will translate, of course, on the ground to armies as well, and the ability to reach out and be in touch with your troops somewhere out on the field. Now, voice led to music. Someone got the idea, wait a minute, why don't I send music over the radio? What a concept. And suddenly we can provide entertainment, real time, to thousands and thousands of listeners once you could afford to buy a radio. It's kind of cool. Police departments, major cities around the world began to realize the power of the radio. I believe the first ever police department to use a radio system was actually from Australia. They figured out you could broadcast one way to cars, and in fact, they used the same frequency band as AM radio, but just down at the very bottom of the band. And then they evolved into two-way radio systems in the cars that had their own dedicated frequencies. Let's spend a little more time on amateur radio, or ham radio. There's a lot of questions on why it was called ham radio, but we'll leave it at that and you can research that on your own. As we know, Marconi communicated in 1901 across the Atlantic Ocean with a radio device. He had very high power, giant antennas, and was successful in making this work. That was exciting news, and a lot of private citizens in the U.S. and Europe began to experiment with radio. In 1909, they published the first official wireless blue book of the Wireless Association of America, and that contained a listing of 89 amateur radio wireless telegraph stations across the United States and Canada. The bottom line here is stations began to grow, and they kind of began to communicate with each other using Morse code, and they kind of sort of did things on their own. They had their own made up names and call signs, if you will. And Congress, realizing there's a problem here, established the Radioact of 1912. It essentially required all radio amateurs to be licensed and restricted them to a single wavelength, or frequency, if you will, of what we call 200 meters. And I won't get into why they're called meters and what that's all about, but long story short, the government realized that had to be regulated and controlled. It wouldn't prevent anybody from getting a license, but it assured that everyone who got a license was trained, properly knew radio etiquette, understood some theory behind it, and also understood the safety elements, because the people were working with tubes and AC electrical current, and they could hurt themselves if they weren't careful. In 1914, another organization was formed called the American Radio Relay League, or the ARRL, founded by a ham operator named Hiram Percy Maxim. He figured out that if you wanted to send messages over long distances, it could be a little bit more reliable in the message getting where it was going to go if relay stations were set up. So the original purpose of the ARRL was to set up a series of radio relay stations across the United States, which enabled ham operators to send messages from one point of the country to another point of the country, because they really didn't have cross-continental capability yet at this stage. They could send messages between friends, between each other. The rules prohibited them from sending anything about business. This was pure hobby and amateur type of work. They finally began doing transatlantic transmitting and receiving tests in 1921. Bottom line here, amateur radio, the enthusiasts have made major contributions to science, to engineering, to industry, and emergency services, as the organization has existed, not just the ARRL, but amateur operators in general. If you were to look at the makeup of a lot of the engineers in major companies, well into probably the 1990s, you would find a good number of them were either active or former amateur radio operators, because that's how they got the bug. That's how they got enthused about it. There were radio clubs in high schools that people could join and learn about this stuff. So I really wanted to bring amateur radio into this conversation because they had a huge impact on how things evolve on the wireless side. We're going to switch to the commercial side, and I'm going to highlight one company in particular, and that's Motorola. Motorola started as the Galvin rather, manufacturing company. Back in 1928, they made what's called a battery eliminator for cars, or for radios rather. Radios needed batteries to run, big old dry cell batteries. They were clunky, hard to make, and so the Galvin company was trying to make something to eliminate that. Meanwhile, a guy by the name of Bill Lear, and Bill Lear, by the way, that name might be a little familiar. Lear Jets. Actually, Lear was quite the entrepreneur and inventor. But in this case, he and a fellow by the name of Howard Gates, who worked for the Zenith Corporation, another radio corporation, more of a receiving radios, not two-way. They figured out, would it be cool to make radio for a car? To receive radio like music. They showed the test sets to Paul Galvin, and he kind of looked at him and thought, interesting, but whatever. And then suddenly got to thinking about it, spoke to his team at the company, and they decided to make 200 radios. It was unbelievably popular. So in 1930, he introduced what was known as the Motorola radio. It was one of the first commercially successful car radios. Galvin and Lear then created the brand name of Motorola, and it basically came up with the blend of motor for cars and Ola, which if you think of Victrola and other things, it was sort of like it's implied music and entertainment. That's where the name Motorola came from. It was such a great success, he ended up changing his own company's name to Motorola. There's a picture on the left of the very first, it's a replication of the first car radio in the 1930s, the Model 5T71, and that big black thing on the left was tubes and the electronics. The speaker is what's in the upper right corner, and then that thing in the middle is sort of like the control panel, the knob where you tuned your stations and handled your on and off. And on the right was the very technical diagram to explain to somebody how to install it in your car. Again, this is huge because now we have the ability to have mobile entertainment and music and radio as we are driving around listening. And if you fast forward 80, 90 years, we have mobile entertainment in our smart devices. I'm making a huge leap, but you can see where the concept of having the ability to have this wherever you're traveling was huge. There were many other manufacturers that made two-way radio equipment and did huge development work, and I don't mean to slight them in any way. There was GE, Harris, Collins, a ton of companies that as World War II happens and the technology revolution starts to explode, they were major contributors. But I did want to highlight Motorola because it really sort of was synonymous with the beginning of all of this. So in summary, we've spent some time learning about radio. We talked about one-way broadcasting becoming two-way. We looked at timelines between the telephone and the wireless and saw the evolution in parallels up to around 1925, 1930. We've discovered amateur radio and its impact on the development of radio overall, and we may touch on that in future weeks. We talked about the commercial radio companies such as Motorola and others. Next week, it's going to be real exciting. The Federal Communications Commission and regulation. And we might throw a little tech in there just to kind of make it exciting. Thanks. We'll see you next time.